Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. I'm Carol Newcomb-Aludo, the chair of the Board of Trustees. It's great to see you all today, especially on such a nice spring day. Doesn't look like it's going to rain out there, and it's getting warmer. We are very proud today that it is the Mary Lazarus Legacy Fund celebrating Women in Society's Forum. And this is titled Women's Fund Wealth Gap Report. We're very pleased to have them here today, and we're very pleased that Mary has sponsored this. Thank you, Mary. It's also sponsored by Ohio State University, Barbara Fergus, GBQ Cardinal Health, and in partnership, of course, with the Women's Fund of Central Ohio. Each are represented here by many friends and associates. Please help me thank them all. Now, to introduce our forum, please welcome Managing Director at GBQ, Darcy Congrove. Darcy.
Thanks, Carol. GBQ is pleased to support the Columbus Metropolitan Club and all of the great conversation that happens here every week. I am thrilled today to see so many friends, literally and figuratively, in the auditorium, or not the room, you know what I'm saying. I see the flags on the tables, and I know that there are a number of companies here and organizations within our community who are doing great work on behalf of women and girls, and so we thank you for being here. It would be remiss if I did not mention as a Women's Fund board member that this is the third research report that the Women's Fund has presented at the Columbus Metropolitan Club, and the third time that the room has sold out. So we appreciate that support. GBQ is all about women in leadership roles, and we're doing that not just within our office, but also within our community. And I've got two partners here with me today who are setting that standard. Ellen Black here is serving on the New Directions Career Center Board, and Rebecca Smith is serving on the YWCA board. So thank you. Today, we're excited to support a conversation around gender equity and the need to better understand the lay of the land here in our community. Let's welcome the people who understand these issues and have helped move the needle towards change. Please welcome President and CEO of the Women's Fund of Central Ohio, Kelley Griesmer. Executive Director of the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity, Derrick Hamilton. President and CEO of the YWCA Columbus, Christie Angel. And last but certainly not least, because she's the woman with the data, Suparna Bhaskaran, who is the senior researcher at the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society. Suparna's going to start us off with an overview of the study results, and then Christie Angel is going to dive into the conversation with all of us. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank the Women's Fund to invite me to this panel discussion. Before we move on to the panel discussion, I would first like to contextualize and highlight for you some key findings from the research report prepared by the Institute for Women's Policy Research, and this was commissioned by the Women's Fund of Central Ohio. The report is called Assets for Equity, Building Wealth for Women in Central Ohio. National conversations about inequality refer to income and wealth when framing the problem, but typically focus on income when discussing solutions. So many of us in this room have heard, and it goes, women who work full-time in the US year-round earn 80 cents to the dollar earned by men. When broken down further by racial difference, we also hear Latinas own 53 cents, Native women earn 58 cents, Black women earn 61 cents, and so on and so forth. Focusing on income alone is not enough to ensure women's long-term prosperity because it's only part of the problem. So what is wealth? Wealth and income are definitely related, but wealth is different from income. Wealth is what you own minus what you owe. Wealth is having a rainy day fund, like enough savings to weather unexpected hardships and emergencies, like a sick child or a family member, or job loss. Wealth allows you to have proactive control over your life and plan for your future. Wealth is having equity in a business or a home. Wealth is having resources for a secure retirement, like your nest egg. Wealth, most importantly, is intergenerational, can be passed down from generation to generation, like an inheritance. Wealth provides opportunities to influence economic, political, and social agendas, whether for social change or to maintain the status quo. So why gender and racial wealth gaps? Public policies in the US have played an active role in determining who gets to build wealth and who doesn't. Wealth inequality impacts many communities and many individuals, but it's important to look at the histories and cultural practices of systemic gender and racial discrimination and how they intersect. For example, the US has a very long history of promoting property ownership, but many individuals and communities have been and remain excluded from these policies. For instance, under systems of slavery and patriarchy, women, particularly women of color, were viewed as property. And under more recent policies of redlining and reverse redlining, this tradition continues via subprime lending to economically vulnerable women, including senior women and women of color. Here are some highlights from the report. The report begins to spark important conversations about the intersection of the gender and the racial wealth gap in Central Ohio and potential solutions. These recommendations will be discussed during our conversation. The report stands out because the national conversation about this is still emerging. The report showcases different ways in which the wealth gap widens cumulatively for women in Central Ohio. For instance, women tend to be concentrated in low-wage service occupations and are more likely to work in part-time jobs. With these lower earnings, there's less to save and invest. And there are multiple reasons for why women work part-time. Wealth building, as a result, is further stripped due to lack of employer-provided benefits and out-of-pocket expenses that result because of those lack of those benefits. So not having health insurance shifts the financial risk onto you with more out-of-pocket costs. Plus, you have to also contend with things like not having paid leave or unaffordable childcare. The report also found that the poverty data underscores the intergenerational and cyclical aspects of the wealth gap. The report found that 41.5% of households that are below the poverty level are headed primarily by single women, breadwinners, and with children under 18. Economically vulnerable single women with children face some of the largest asset-building barriers, particularly since policy solutions only focus on income and penalize asset building. The report also interviewed local program leaders in Central Ohio, and one recommendation in particular stood out to me. They said, listen to those who are most affected by the problem or policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Suparna. Thank you all for being here with us today. So we're going to dispense with the bio reading today because we want to jump right into this report. There's not enough time, and we want to remind everyone that this is the start of a conversation, not the end of a conversation. Thank you. So let's first just talk about why it's important now to address the wealth gap and look at gender and wealth gap locally. I know, at the YWCA, we see the symptoms of problems. We stand at the kind of epicenter of women when they are experiencing a crisis. So talk to us a little bit about why now. Kelley, why don't you take that?
Well, I think that, the Women's Fund, when it started about 18 years ago, it was founded as a moment of courage to talk about things that are difficult. And that's not something that women do. And at the time, our founders realized that women, even of wealth, weren't using their power to invest and themselves and the issues they were so familiar with as women watching other women in our community. And so there's a moment of strength that we realize that despite having seen a lot of the difficult things that our country has gone through, we also see that there's now a breakthrough with regard to people believing us that these things exist. Earlier in our history, it was about making people aware that these things were out there and them not believing us. This is taking a moment where people now believe us and using our opportunity to move out and really dig into it, which is to say, this isn't just about equal pay. This is about something that is definitely multifaceted, and equal pay is a very important piece of it, but not the only piece. And we wanted to take this opportunity to look at the wider lens of all of the women of our community, and start to figure out how all these things intersect.
Other panelists?
The why now, we're at a point where the top 0.1% of the population controls as much of the nation's wealth as the bottom 90%. So we're at a point of extreme concentration of wealth. And wealth is about power, as Suparna described in her opening. It gives you agency, but it's also about political power. Having that concentration at the top allows people to capture our politics in a way where they can set structures to further enrich themselves. The issue of local, we know that asset markets are local. What takes place in Columbus, Ohio, in terms of what it means to own a home is different than what it might mean in Los Angeles. We can also examine policy in a local level. So if there are predatory types of lending products like payday loans, for instance, we can see how local policies might impact access and utilization of those type of predatory products in a place like Columbus than in comparison to a place like Boston, where the state of Massachusetts pretty much outlaws them.
Derrick, I want to go back to something. I know that you are new to the Columbus market, but you also have done some of this research in other markets. Can you just talk a little bit about maybe what you've seen in other markets and how we compare?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. I've been part of a group that's doing this National Asset Scorecard for Communities of Color. So we looked at assets and debt in Boston, Miami, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, Tulsa, Oklahoma. So we chose geographically spatial areas to get a purview of the country. And then we went a step further and didn't use our broad categories of black, white, Latinx, but rather disaggregated by ancestral origin. So what it means to be a Cuban in Miami might be different to what it means to be Puerto Rican in Boston, for example, or what it means to be Korean in Los Angeles versus Washington, D.C. And just some high-level points is, for example, I was at a similar panel like this, and someone of Korean descent, when we released the L.A. report, he said, last night I went to bed thinking I was a model minority. This morning I woke up and read your report and realized I wasn't. And he was saying that tongue-in-cheek, but the net wealth position, despite mythical, the mythology around Asian progress, is that a Korean living in Los Angeles, their net wealth position is much lower than that of, say, D.C. So it's indicative that if we really want to understand stratification, we need to look at a local context where you have similar products and infrastructure, and we also need to disaggregate by ancestral origin. I know I'm talking a lot. Let me say one last point. I got the look. We oversampled incarcerated households in Baltimore. So we were able to get at the intersection of both race and incarceration status. And probably to nobody's surprise, those that either a family member or themselves were incarcerated and black had the lowest levels of net wealth in the city. But what was surprising is that the variation between being incarcerated or not was not as pronounced, was more pronounced than what it was between being black or white. So we had a scenario where for black individuals, whether or not you were incarcerated, your wealth was so low that the added negative impact of being incarcerated was not that big, especially comparison across race. So race trumped incarceration status when it came to wealth.
Thank you. So we've heard, and Suparna, you did a great job of just talking us through the difference between pay equity and pay, wealth. But talk to us a little bit more about, we've heard, right, gender and wealth gap, that it's much larger than the wage gap. So can you kind of expand on that a little bit and talk to us about that?
Okay. So some of the things that I alluded to before was why wealth is distinctly different. One is that you can inherit it. So that's something that really kind of marks and speaks to the figure that Derrick mentioned, that this is why we're seeing increasing concentration of wealth. And people with more wealth get to influence policy. And so it's in order to understand how the racial wealth gap as well as the gender wealth gap fall together or come together is to then beginning to think about how we can think about women's economic mobility out of these situations, and to think about security in the future. And so it's important to distinguish the two, because that's when things like differences in power or having a voice in the political process and how we engage in the political process goes up, especially with those who do not have wealth. And we can actually start thinking about how can one who doesn't have that much wealth have any kind of role in terms of how to imagine a better future. And to think about things like owning a home or getting a quality education and not be constantly stripped back of assets, because policies are actively made by people so that they either strip you of wealth or just want certain groups to be taxed advantage so that can be concentrated in the few hands.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Kelley, I know for 18 years, the Women's Fund has been kind of at the, you have been focused on not just funding and building the fund, but you've also been focused on advocacy and policy. So given what we're learning about the wealth gap, where do we go from here in terms of building more of an umbrella kind of approach to this?
Well, I think that throughout my career in nonprofit, one thing that I've realized is I run into people every day who say, I want to end poverty. And they mean that absolutely sincerely. And the reason that I think that being at the Women's Fund and our role in advocacy is so important is because I think women are the business case for ending poverty. It's the fact that we have not gotten past our implicit biases about gender and race, and we haven't spoke vulnerably about those things and been willing to address it. And so advocacy, we talk a lot about big A advocacy versus little a advocacy. I don't care which A it is. I'm out there to tell you that I know, as a woman who's been given great opportunity and great support in many forums in my life, that I have not accumulated wealth the way many of my male colleagues have. And if I haven't, I need to be thinking about the women that have not had the opportunities that I've had yet, and how we create those things. And this is a business case. If we think about something like childcare in a vacuum, and we go vote, for a certain initiative, and we're thinking, oh, it's capitalist, and we let business owners decide what they're going to do. These women, the great number of women, single women who are leading our families, 41% of them are living in poverty. And that child care is everything that they need to start to get out of that. And so we, on the one hand, say we want to end poverty, and on the other hand, we don't support the things that are the very things that they need for doctrinal reasons that don't make any sense. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we have to be honest with ourselves about that. And so...
Absolutely. As an organization that provides childcare to homeless families as well as to working moms and dads in suburban communities, we know that oftentimes that childcare is the difference maker in whether someone can go earn a living and take care of themselves, or go look for housing so they can get out of a shelter environment. So thank you for just pressing on that issue. But we know there are so many, many more things that drive wealth. And so why is it important? So the intersectionality, right? Intersectionality, we're all talking about intersectionality now and the intersection between race and gender and so forth. So talk to us a little bit more about gender norms, intersectionality. I mean, I think everyone here can probably address it. I'll let you fight for the mic.
Okay.
She won the arm wrestle.
Suparna reference, I mean, we talked about pink lining, for instance, right? So let's give the audience just, a little bit of kind of what that means and what that's done, in our community.
A couple of years ago, I had written a piece called Pink Lining, and it was kind of a tongue-in-cheek reference. I wasn't super thrilled about the pink part of the pink lining, but I finally agreed to it. But it was like a building on policies of reverse redlining, which in essence, the policy was groups, individuals, and communities that were initially targeted earlier on in history, specifically like formerly in the 1930s, the phenomenon of redlining, where they were either denied loans or given subprime loans and segregated in very specific zip codes and neighborhoods. Later on, since the 1980s and 90s onwards, were targeted once again, but targeted for subprime lending. And in many of these instances, there were communities of color, senior women, and so pink lining kind of is an attempt at looking at the intersections of race, gender, and socioeconomic class, and how these policies, in many ways, continue to strip wealth and prevent asset building. For a lot of people, particularly in the middle classes, having a home is one of the largest assets. For the wealthiest few, that is not necessarily their number one asset. There are a whole bunch of other areas stock options and real estate that they can depend on. But to get back to the issue of intersectionality, intersectionality, I know it's a big buzzword, but it's an older concept that, women, for instance, just take women. We're not a homogeneous group. We have a gender identity, we have a racial identity, socioeconomic class, sexuality, age, immigration status. And so some of these identities confers us with advantages and opportunities. Others absolutely do not. And so we live in those intersections of opportunity and disadvantage. And so intersectionality kind of can help us to make smarter policy solutions, or the solutions can be more nuanced. And they can actually be more effective when you look at that we're not just a blob, that we are actually a pretty heterogeneous group.
I think Suparna said am I mispronouncing your name? I'm sorry.
No,
Suparna, I think she said the key word when she used the word nuance. I think one mistake that we make when we look at intersectionality is we think it's linear. We oversimplify it and think that, black and woman is bad. That's overly simplistic, that it's hard to divorce men or women from their larger family context. So when we think about, for example, incarceration, Obviously, Becky Pettit wrote the book Invisible Men. We oftentimes ignore that segment of the population while they're incarcerated from our statistics. But the other point is the impact it has on families and women in particular. We put a lot of caregiving responsibility on women in our patriarchal society, whether they're in their immediate family or extended family, which both takes time and resources. So when I guess the point that we really need to understand, and I think a concept like wealth really roots out our notions about rugged individualism, that everybody is on their own as an individual, irrespective of their identity, both in the ways that wealth is accumulated, both in the ways, and even the report, because of our limitations with data, it looked at single women and single men. But even within the same household, we understand there's power dynamics. We understand that who has agency in making decisions about what to do with those finances and how they're used and accumulated. That's based on power. So, the next step will be to figure out how do we get at that power dynamic within the household, and it's complicated, but I think the larger point is that wealth roots out this rugged individualism narrative, and that intersectional identities are nuanced, but they certainly matter.
And Kelley, the Women's Fund, you were involved in some of the gender equity work. I mean, why was it important in this report to look at not just gender, but to look at the intersectionality?
Well, because, this is a city where we have to admit we have very stark differences in experience. And to Derrick's point, the work that we've done, even in gender, as you dig into this research, even finding as a representative sample of women, it's much harder for our diverse communities to even respond to a survey, to have time to respond to a survey or participate in a focus group. So we're missing, as you're doing this, you have to think so hard, because to that point, there's design thinking that gets us to the solutions, and you cannot design the solutions without talking to the people who are experiencing it. And the women, some of the women that are living in poverty, you will see the data shows how it intersects with their backgrounds as Black women or Latino women, what they own compared. So we think that it's it's so important to understand their experience to be able to solve for it. Because to their point, to Suparna's point about us, we're not a blob. And if you just, we in the beginning, women had to speak about each other as a collective, because just to get anyone's attention to talk about that was a big deal. And so to my earlier point, it's time for us to start pointing out that we can start talking about our differences as much as our similarities.
And that's one of the things that, I think as everyone reads the report, you have a copy at your desk, or your desk. Yeah, your desk.
There'll be a test.
I'm back at work. There'll be a test, yes. But you have a copy of it, and what you should know, I mean, is we went to places where women, where they are being served, maybe as a client or someone who is experiencing poverty. It was not just go talk to women of a certain age or wealth or race, so that we could look at some of the points of intersectionality. So before I ask what will probably be the final question of the panel, I want to remind everyone that we are nearing the point in the conversation where we begin to ask questions. The microphone is somewhere over there. Andy's pointing at the microphone, and we have about 5 minutes. So as you think about your question and get ready and line up and so forth, we'll be ready for you in just a few minutes. So we've heard a little bit about the data. Everyone has the report. We've talked about intersectionality and why it's important to look at this at the local level. Now let's talk about a few solutions, right? So I know we don't have all the answers, but can we talk a little bit about how do we change something that is so deeply entrenched? And where do we start?
Well, I think that, the first thing you start is just even with financial education for women. it is something that's overlooked at all levels. And certainly, you know, those of us who have had some professional careers that bring us in contact with that, it's almost by accident. So financial education is important, understanding childcare, understanding paid family leave, and really understanding how this, if you do want to fix poverty, how those things impact poverty, connect those dots, and talk about it. I mean, there is a, you know, advocate for changes in your companies, in your schools, and, you know, donate. You know, and I think, you know, we mentioned subprime lending and things like that as well. Those are things that we really have to pay attention to, because these are places where women, because of their desire to get out of poverty, will buy a home and take a bad loan, will get student loans that they can't afford. You know, they're trying to do the right thing. And yet we are actually setting them back worse than if they hadn't tried. And that you know, so we have to dig into those kinds of things and start to find solutions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I would amplify that point that Kelley just mentioned. You know, there's something pernicious about a society when somebody's trying to better themselves. They're their most vulnerable, especially when they come from a subaltern background. They're open to predation, and we all can get got. Bernie Madoff scandal demonstrates that the most sophisticated amongst us can be got by a financial industry that might be hell-bent on extracting if they put their mind to it without having some regulation to rein it in. That said, a policy that I've been promoting a lot is called baby bonds. And these are not really bonds, but they're trust accounts set up at birth. So everyone would have a birthright to capital, and those accounts would be seeded based on the family position that you're born into. So if you're born in the most wealthy family, you get an account because it's part of the social bond, but your account is nowhere near as large as that if you're born into the poorest family. And when you become a young adult, you can use that account to put you into a vehicle that will passively appreciate over your lifetime, like a home, like a college education without debt, or like some capital to start a business. The source of inequality, for the most part, is that some young adults have access to some capital or some vehicle to put them in an asset that will passively appreciate over their life, and others do not. One last point about this, how could this affect gender and race? The American narrative often ties people to their families, so in a somewhat counterintuitive way, this is intended to divorce you from your family. You have, as an individual, some capital irrespective of good or bad decisions that your family may make.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I figured this would also be a good time to highlight a national initiative called the Closing the Women's Wealth Gap. In 2016, early 2016, a handful of leaders, they were researchers, they were funders, they were advocates, they were community organizers who had a phone call, and they decided that you know, they wanted to broaden this conversation to go beyond just simply income and talk about wealth, and to actually have people grow a knowledge base and increase engagement and understanding and expertise and momentum around this. And there's something on your, there's a flyer on your table about closing the women's wealth gap. And so this organization actually has grown, and there are over 400 people and organizations that are involved, and they're both members of the private sector, public sector, they're academics, they're activists, and so on. So in many ways, the solutions can be like drawn out from just you, us. And this organization, the Closing the Women's Wealth Gap, their goal is to talk about economic mobility and financial security for women, for women's future. But a lot of the solutions are targeted towards women who are most negatively impacted by wealth inequality. So for low to moderate income women, women of color, LGBTQ women, immigrant women who are undocumented, and so on and so forth. And some of the things that this organization has done since 2016 has been to actually work with the partners that are all over the nation around specific issues such as one what Derrick just mentioned around baby bonds, but also around national paid leaves, also around thinking about a caregiving security as well for caregivers. The other kinds of areas that the National Initiative has done work in is to commission reports on the heterogeneous group that, of women. So there's a report that they've done on millennials, on single women, and there's one coming up in the summer about women-owned businesses. And finally, this group was kind of dealing with the paucity in the data in regards to the women in the wealth gap. And so they are partnering with the Federal Reserve to actually improve their data collection and to ask questions. So if you don't ask the questions, if you don't bring the framework of intersectional thinking, you don't have the answers, so therefore you don't exist. And so the issue doesn't exist. And so that kind of influences the kinds of policies that get crafted. So I think the solutions are also to come together across the various walks of lives that we're in.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of coming together, before I give the CMC message, I do want to point out that we're lucky enough to have Congresswoman Beatty with us here today, and Congresswoman Beatty serves Congresswoman Beatty serves on the Financial Services and Banking Committee of the U.S. House of Representatives and chairs a subcommittee, I believe it is, on diversity and inclusion in banking and finance. So speaking of truth to power, power to action, we have someone here who served on both boards of these organizations that we can actually work with to perhaps bring about some change at the national level. So we look forward to getting more involved with your work. Now, it is CMC's tradition to take audience questions. Please state your name and ask your question with the question mark. Please avoid editorial comments and remember, yes, questions in with the question mark. So let's get started. You have the first question.
My name is Stephanie Mitchell-Hughes. I live here in Columbus. One of the things that I believe is very important when you are addressing the issue that you're talking about, because they can be extremely complex and they're also very integrated, is to really humanize it by talking to the people who live it. And you've referenced this. I am by profession a lawyer. I've been a lawyer for a long time. But in 2006, my children and I started over, literally. 2 months of outstanding mortgage payments, $120, an empty refrigerator, and 2 kids. That's where I started. And every time over the last 13 years I have encountered a roadblock, I have found myself thinking there has to be a way to handle this particular issue, because these roadblocks, as you said, can really knock you off your feet. And so I guess the thing that I will say and add to the conversation is the criticality of social capital and coming together and being very supportive, but it also is changing the perception and the idea about what poverty is and to stop treating it as if it is a crime. In any other business setting, businesses would run a focus group. They talk to their users on how to make their product better. People don't talk to poor people. They don't talk to people who are struggling. But I was, and other people who are like me, but with substantially less education, no one talks to us. So that's just my observation. Thank you.
Thank you.
I mean, I know Stephanie, and thank you for sharing your experience with us today. I know but she's been a great advisor to me over the years, and it's good to hear you sharing it with such a large group. Thank you.
I'll just comment really quick and say that when it comes to wealth, there has never been a black middle class. Black people have made strides in terms of being occupational status, even income status and education status. But if we look at wealth throughout our history, the numbers are such that there has never been one. And it speaks to the vulnerability of people, even when they do acquire the high levels of education, the high levels of income, when you tell the narrative that you did. Indeed, I think wealth becomes a good outcome to look at the tragedy of America, but also it provides optimism. Because it wasn't always the case that there was a white asset-based middle class, that there was public policy that intervened in a way to give people access to a vehicle of accumulation at a key point in their life that generated an asset-based middle class for whites, like a GI Bill, like FHA loans. So there's the story of optimism. The story of optimism is that we actually can do something to provide economic security for people, and we have a historical precedent to do so.
Hi, I'm Angela Petro, and in full disclosure, I am on the board of the Women's Fund. So I'm not a plant in this question. I'm going to ask this as a citizen and as a business owner of Columbus. I love this city. I love running a business in this city. I love the work that we're doing, and I want to see more. I don't see enough right now happening at the city level and the local level of how we're going to attack these issues, both racially and from a gender lens. What are the low-hanging fruit? I'm looking at Derrick and I'm looking at you, Kelley. What are the low-hanging fruit we should be challenging our local community, government, and organizations to tackle first?
I mean, there's lots of things we can do at the local level. Especially around an indicator like wealth, but to me the problems are more political than economic. So the fact that you have this group convening now to organize, why don't we try a demonstration project around baby bonds in Columbus? And we don't have to start at babies, we could start with people in high school. What if we thought about trying to figure out seeding accounts for people at a certain level that they can access when they become a young adult, and watch how that transforms their lives? There are other policies we could think about as well. We could think about how do we provide people access to home ownership as opposed to being a renter, for example. I probably could come up with more, but I think the point is we don't have to wait for the federal government to provide some demonstrations about the power of capital at a key point in somebody's life.
Yeah, and I mean, similarly, I mean, we have laws in Columbus with regard to the way that women can be, or families can be evicted, which does adversely impact a lot of single-family, mother-family homes, and they can be evicted by affidavit. Like, the landlord doesn't even have to come. And as a lawyer, that's remarkable to me. Dayton's outlawed it, Toledo's outlawed it, and yet here in Central Ohio, we allow that to happen. And when I talk to magistrates about it, it's like, well, this has been around for a long time, and I understand there's a lot of things that have been around for a long time, but we can start to attack those policies.
Hi, I'm Mark Allen. I'm a freelance copy editor in a field that's probably 80% women, and many of them are not here because they're working women and they have children. And I married well. I have health insurance. I have a regular paycheck that comes in whether I have work or not. So I appreciate my privilege in that. But my question is, and I'll try to disguise any editorializing in this question, but we talk about what we can do locally, and that's great. It seems to me I like to look at the other level, and aren't there some very simple solutions that would not maybe get us to equity, but would get us to a bit more equity? And that is, and some things you've identified, if we have support for child care, if we have affordable health care, and I'm thinking we're moving to an economy where people are less reliant on the support of the workplace and more reliant on themselves, working from home. Aren't there some easy solutions here? And aren't those two things, and probably another one is you talked about the predatory lending, if we have some, if we can rein that in. I mean, if we just do those things at the federal level, wouldn't that be a huge, huge benefit to taking care of this problem?
you know, there's no one single policy that will solve all these issues, but you point out that what I'm hearing from your question is that there are a set of enabling goods and services that people need in their lives to flourish, and there's a role for government to provide those goods. Ultimately, I think the federal government will have to be engaged in our next evolution as a democracy, where we went from a Bill of Rights, civil rights. We haven't done economic rights. We've started it, but we haven't fulfilled it. And this is not socialism in that I'm proposing that we get rid of the market and the private sector altogether, but there are probably a set of goods and services that we shouldn't leave to the fiduciary responsibility to maximize profit of the private sector, where the pricing and the rationing of those goods become internalized to care to that responsibility, that there is a role of government. So we need to change the narratives by which we've thought of government nowadays as always being bad and efficient, and take it back. There is a role for our political power to take back government so that it is used for the purpose of enabling its citizens, its people, et cetera, so that they can flourish with some economic bills of rights.
Hi, good afternoon. My name's Eric Brown, and currently I'm a member of the Columbus City School Board. Question that I have, and I've got two questions. The first bigger question is about education and about the impact of this gap of all of these issues, whether racial or gender or poverty, upon the next generation and beyond. If families are facing all of these issues, and I know that it's very tough to get out of it, and it's very tough to survive. The kids from those families who are supposed to come to school and learn, and we know that education is a great pathway out of the kind of poverty that we see, they're not ready to learn because they're dealing with issues of survival, housing, food, clothing, transportation. And how do we take the step as a community to really wrap our arms around these families and around these kids to provide them the basics so that they can benefit from the education that's available and have a future? The second question is a shorter one. I can identify with Kelley, and I appreciate what she said about wealth and not being able to accumulate wealth. But at the same time, I do identify as somebody of privilege, because I've got access to resources and people and contacts. And it's difficult sometimes to understand privilege and wealth is two different things. But the question was triggered by something you said about providing financial education to young women. And the reality is that our young men need that just as importantly. And I can't think of a reason why, for that type of education in particular, why there needs to be a gender focus.
Okay, well.
So,
all right, there's two questions, and one's a big one. On the first question, I mean, it's interesting. Someone just sent us Groundwork Ohio sent over a report to us last night that our team was looking at, and it shows the marked difference that any child living in an economically disadvantaged situation, their third grade reading proficiency is worse than a child that's actually living in a family with some wealth. And so, again, to my earlier point about connecting the dots, you have to be able to, there are institutes, like the Seymour Institute has taken important steps toward realizing that children that don't have stable homes can't benefit from their education. That's the kind of connecting the dots that we need to be doing in our community to realize you can't have eviction laws that allow kids to be thrown to the street every day and also expect them to achieve in school. Those are connected things. And so I think that there's no easy answer to that question other than connecting those dots. I will say, with regard to my comment about financial, and this is where I will say, implicit bias is real. And as again, a woman who has had great privilege and great opportunity, I have also watched the advice and the guidance that's been given to me over the course of my career. And as I look back, if I'm completely honest, I know people have looked at me and thought, she will be taken care of. And what I also realize is that when my friends and colleagues, if their marriage breaks down, if there's a death, very often those women find themselves in a very difficult situation. So I do think there is a gender lens that has to be applied to women because generations have told us we will be taken care of, and that may be implicit, and that doesn't mean that anyone in this room set out to not improve what women have access to, but implicitly, we've missed it, and we need to,
This is another question where data, I think, becomes useful, and it adds to the story Kelley just gave about eviction and education. We know that if you're a head of household and you're black and you have a college degree, you have about 2/3 the wealth of a white household where the head dropped out of high school. Perhaps we have the causality wrong. Perhaps it's not as much education leading to wealth, but wealth leading to education. I'm a university professor and I'm committed to education. For the intrinsic value of education, that's enough for me. I think that we can afford the privilege for everybody to be able to synthesize information and translate it into big ideas. I'm committed to that, and I think we can as a society. But we exaggerate the functional role of education in terms of economic outcomes to the detriment of understanding the functional role of wealth.
That's our final question.
Hi, my name is Nicole Felice Lopez. Thank you for the time. My question pertains directly to nonprofits in Columbus. And we're talking about empowering women and opening up opportunity. How do the nonprofits in Columbus ever get together to talk about easing opportunities for women? And this comes from a conversation I was having with my husband the other night. I've applied to 1 million different positions in Columbus. I've had introductions from folks I know to leadership in nonprofits. I come from a very lucky position of coming from a high trauma environment, but still got through self-supporting an undergrad and managed to do grad at an Ivy, and I am completely invisible in Columbus. Any woman I reach out to in leadership, no response. Jobs that you apply to that have archaic and complicated questions to answer that feel more like they're trolling for ideas, and you never get a response back about whether you've even been received. And I said to my husband, I'm like, I'm lucky. We do fine. You've got a great job. When things stagnate here, we can pick up and go to another city. But what about all the women that I have worked with in nonprofits, as a public school teachers, and even in socially focused corporations? I think about all those women, and I think about how difficult it is for me understanding how to operate these systems, how to network, and I can't even get anywhere in this city. What about all those women who your nonprofits tell a great story of empowerment, but it seems like you keep hiring the same people. It's all the same people running in the same circles. Half the time you can tell they already knew who they were going to hire for the position before it was filled. And like I said, we're mobile enough that we can go someplace else. But what about everybody else who's trying to make their way up and can't even get a light shined on them? I mean, you can message leadership through LinkedIn, you can email them, nothing. So how are the nonprofits going to do better about opening it up for women who don't run in the same circles, for people who are from Columbus, who are connected? That's what I'd like to know.
Thank you.
Well, I mean, first of all, yeah. I mean, I think that one of the most important things that I think women can do is engage with women. I think that the fact that we've had such limited opportunities in some of our careers has bred a culture of scarcity, and that the only people who can break through that culture of scarcity are women. So I think one of the most important things we as the Women Fund can take on is reminding women that women supporting women is what will change the world. And I mean, your story's a great reminder, but I can tell you, reach out and we'll talk, you know, let's talk.
Other questions? Other answers?
I guess there was one very good response to that question anyway. I hope you found today's forum eye-opening and worthy of further thought and action on your part. You might want to take the step of going to the Closing Women's Wealth Gap reports and taking a look. It sounded very interesting to me anyway. Let's thank our sponsors, the Mary Lazarus Legacy Fund, and the Ohio State University, Barbara Fergus, GPQ, Cardinal Health, and Partners, and the Women's Fund of Central Ohio, and also our speakers today, Christie Angel, Suparna, Bhaskaran, Darrick Hamilton, and Carrie Griesmer. Thank you. See you all next Wednesday.